I don't know where to begin. Maybe from that night when I stood outside his house for the first time in 27 years. The rain was falling hard, washing the dust off the wooden porch, and I was clutching my small suitcase like it was the only thing keeping me alive. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from fear that he'd look at me and somehow just know. My name is Margaret Fields, though everyone at the time just called me Maggie the maid. But long before that, I was a mother. His mother. You see, I gave birth to my son, Daniel, when I was just 19. His father, Robert, left before the ink even dried on our marriage papers. Said he needed freedom. What he really meant was, he didn't want to be tied to a poor girl from Kansas who could barely afford shoes for her baby. I raised Daniel for 5 years alone. Just the two of us in a little yellow house by the river. I still remember the smell of baby powder, the way his tiny hand would wrap around my finger, how he used to giggle when I made silly faces with mashed peas on my nose. Those were the happiest years of my life. But happiness has a cruel way of testing you. One winter night, Daniel fell sick. Pneumonia. I sold everything, my sewing machine, my wedding ring, even the gold locket my mother left me, just to keep him alive. But the hospital bills kept coming, and I was drowning. A kind-looking couple visited us then, the Harrisons. They were rich, childless, and desperate to be parents. They offered to help. Said they'd pay for Daniel's treatment if I let them temporarily adopt him. I was so naive, so desperate. I thought I'd get him back once he recovered. But once I signed those papers, he was gone. Just like that. The Harrisons moved out of town, changed their number, their address. I spent the next 2 decades searching, praying, begging, but it was like my boy had vanished into thin air. Years passed. My hair turned gray, my knees began to ache, and my prayers got quieter. But one afternoon, while cleaning at a local diner, I overheard 2 women gossiping at the counter. "Did you hear about the Harrisons' boy?" one said. "He's all grown up now. Runs a big company downtown. Married that fancy city girl, Claire." My heart stopped. Daniel. It had to be him. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept whispering his name like a secret prayer. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. The next morning, I put on my cleanest dress, took the bus to the city, and stood outside his company building. I saw him. My boy. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything I owned. He looked so much like his father, except kinder. I wanted to run to him, to tell him who I was, but I froze. What if he hated me? What if he thought I'd abandoned him? So instead, I followed him home. He lived in a white 2-story house with a little garden out front. And as fate would have it, there was a help wanted sign on the gate. They were looking for a maid. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was destiny, but I walked up to that door and knocked. Claire, his wife, opened it. She was beautiful. Cold eyes, perfect posture, the kind of woman who made you feel small without saying a word. "Yes," she asked. I came about the maid position," I whispered. She looked me up and down like she was measuring my worth. Then she sighed and said, "Fine. Let's see how you do." And that's how I started working in my own son's house, cleaning his floors, washing his clothes, cooking his meals. Every morning, I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, and my heart would ache with pride and pain all at once. He'd nod politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Fields," he'd say. That's what they called me, Mrs. Fields, the maid. He didn't know he was saying good morning to the woman who gave him life. At night, when they'd go to sleep, I'd quietly enter his study. I'd touch his baby pictures, still framed on a shelf, and trace my fingers over that same smile I once kissed 1,000 times. Sometimes I'd whisper, "It's me, Danny. Mama's here." But of course he couldn't hear me. Claire treated me like furniture. If the silverware wasn't polished right, she'd sneer. If dinner was late, she'd say, "What am I even paying you for, old woman?" And I'd just smile softly because what else could I do? Every insult, every harsh word, I took it quietly. Because this house, this boy, he was my purpose again. Sometimes, when Daniel was alone, I'd catch glimpses of the boy I once knew. He'd hum the same lullaby I used to sing to him, though he didn't know why he remembered it. It's just something from childhood, he once told Claire. But I knew.
Oh, I knew.
Then came the day everything changed.
It was a Sunday.
The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for apple pie, his favorite, when I heard shouting from upstairs. Claire's voice, sharp like broken glass. Daniel's, low and tired. I tried not to listen, but then I heard her say, "You're just like your real mother, pathetic and useless." My heart dropped. She knew.
She knew about me.
Later that night, after she stormed out, Daniel sat in the living room, head in his hands. I wanted to comfort him, to hold him the way I used to, but I couldn't. I just stood there, trembling, my hands covered in flour and tears. He looked up at me and said quietly, "Mrs. Fields, why do you care so much?" I froze. All the years of silence, of pretending, came crashing down. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Only a whisper escaped, "Because I've waited my whole life to see you happy." He stared at me, confused, but before I could say anything more, the phone rang. Claire's voice on the other end, cold as ever. "I'm leaving," she said. "I can't live with a man who doesn't know who he really is." That was the moment everything began to unravel. And that's where my story truly begins, the story of how a mother hid in plain sight, serving her own son, waiting for the day he might look into her eyes and remember. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that it broke you to stay silent, please hit the like button. I just need to know I'm not the only one. I used to think love was enough. That if you love someone hard enough, fate would have no choice but to be kind. But I was wrong. Love isn't a shield. It's a bruise you learn to live with. When I first held Daniel in my arms, the world outside the hospital window was gray with rain, just like the night I found him again years later. I remember how small he was, wrapped in that thin blanket the nurse gave me, because I couldn't afford one of my own. His tiny fists were clenched tight, and when he opened his eyes, it felt like the first sunrise of my life. We lived in a rented room above Mr. Jenkins' hardware store. The floorboards creaked when you walked, and the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbors arguing about bills. But to me, it was heaven because inside that little room was my whole world, my boy, Daniel. Every morning, I'd warm a bottle over the stove and hum old lullabies my mother used to sing. "You are my sunshine," I'd whisper, and he'd giggle, milk dripping down his chin. I'd wipe it off with a corner of my sleeve and say, "Oh, Danny, you'll be someone great one day."
Mama promises.
He used to toddle around the kitchen, dragging a wooden spoon like a toy sword. "I'm the knight, Mama," he'd shout, his voice echoing down the hallway. The other tenants would complain about the noise, but I didn't care. I wanted him to laugh as much as possible, to fill every corner of that tiny apartment with joy before life took notice of us. Sometimes, on Sundays, I'd take him to the park near the river. We'd sit under the old willow tree, and I'd read him stories from torn library books. He'd point at the pictures and ask, "Is that Daddy?" Whenever he saw a man holding a child, I'd swallow hard and smile. "No, sweetheart, that's just a prince." He never met Robert. Never knew how his father walked away when I told him I was pregnant. I remember standing on the porch, rain soaking through my dress, watching his car disappear down that dirt road. My mother's words still ring in my ears. "He'll come back when he's ready." He never did. Still, I held on. Worked at the local diner, washed dishes till my hands cracked, cleaned houses when Daniel slept. Every dollar went to rent and milk and secondhand shoes that were always a size too big. But I didn't mind. Poverty wasn't cruel, it was predictable. You could live with hunger, but not with heartbreak. Then came that winter when Daniel got sick. I can still hear the sound of his coughing, sharp, hollow, endless. His little chest rising and falling like it was fighting against life itself. The doctor said, "He needs treatment in the city hospital." I asked, "How much?" He looked at me, pity in his eyes. "More than you can afford." I begged, borrowed, sold everything that could fetch a penny. And then, like a miracle wrapped in temptation, the Harrisons appeared. They were elegant, soft-spoken. Mrs. Harrison wore pearls even in her kitchen, and Mr. Harrison had the kind of smile that made you trust him before you should. They told me they'd lost their baby 2 years ago. They said they couldn't bear to see another child suffer. "We'll pay for his treatment," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice smooth like honey. "But we'd need your consent legally." I was standing in that cold hospital corridor, Daniel's faint breathing echoing from behind the curtain. The pen shook in my hand as I signed. My tears dropped on the paper and smeared the ink. I still remember that. A mother signing her own name to disappear. They took him that same night. Mrs. Harrison promised, "You'll see him soon. We'll bring him back when he's healthy." But soon never came. Years passed. I'd wake up at dawn sometimes, swearing I heard his laughter down the hallway. I'd rush out of bed, heart pounding, only to find silence. I moved from job to job. Hotel maid, laundress, waitress. But no matter where I went, I'd leave a part of myself behind, hoping somehow he'd find me through the pieces. When I finally found him again, grown, successful, standing beside that beautiful wife, it felt like punishment and mercy all at once. At first, working in his home was unbearable. Every corner reminded me of him as a boy. The way he folded his napkin before eating, the way he tilted his head when thinking it was all the same. Even his laugh, rare but warm, sounded like echoes from the past. One morning, he walked into the kitchen while I was making breakfast. "Smells amazing, Mrs. Fields," he said. I nearly dropped the frying pan. That's exactly what he used to say as a little boy, sitting on the counter while I made pancakes.
Smells amazing, Mana.
I smiled, my throat tightening. "It's just bacon and eggs, sir." He laughed softly. "Well, then you make the best bacon and eggs in the world." After that, something in me started to heal, just a little. I'd see him leave for work, tie crooked, and I'd whisper, "Straighten your ties, sweetheart," though he couldn't hear me. And when he'd fix it in the mirror seconds later, I'd smile. Maybe some bonds never really break. Sometimes, when he came home late, he'd find me still cleaning. "You should rest, Mrs. Fields," he'd say. "You remind me of someone I used to know, my old nanny, maybe. She was kind like you." I wanted to ask about her, to know what he remembered, but I couldn't risk it. So I just said, "She must have loved you very much." He nodded.
She did.
I think. That "I think" tore me apart. Claire, on the other hand, never smiled unless someone important was watching. She had the beauty of a polished stone, cold, flawless, untouchable. But I could tell she didn't love my son the way a wife should. She'd snap at him for small things, like forgetting to water the flowers or spending too much time at work. One evening, while setting the table, I heard her on the phone. "No, he still doesn't know," she whispered. "But soon." I froze behind the door. Didn't know what she meant, but the chill in her voice made my heart pound. Days turned into weeks, and somehow, Daniel began to soften toward me. Maybe it was the food, or maybe it was the comfort of being cared for like a child again, even though he didn't realize it. He'd linger in the kitchen, asking, "How do you make this stew so rich?" "Oh, just a little patience," I'd reply. He'd smile. "My mother used to say that." I looked down at the spoon trembling in my hand. She must have been wise. "She was," he said quietly. "At least, from what I remember." After dinner, when they were watching television, I'd sit in the laundry room, folding clothes. Sometimes I'd press his shirts against my cheek, breathing in the faint scent of cedarwood and coffee, his scent since he was a baby. I know it sounds foolish, but to me, those little moments were prayers. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang, and a delivery man handed me a large box. "For Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," he said. I frowned. Harrison. I took it inside, confused. When Daniel saw the label, his brow furrowed. "That's strange," he muttered. "That's my adoptive parents' name. Must be a mix-up." He opened it. Inside was an old album, yellowed around the edges. "Maybe it's from their estate," he said, flipping through the photos. I saw him stop on one, a woman holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. "That's me," he whispered. "But who's that woman?" I felt the world tilt. It was me, 20 years younger, tired but smiling, holding him in my arms. I turned away quickly, pretending to dust the shelf. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the vase. He frowned, tracing the photo with his thumb. "She looks familiar," he said softly. "There's something about her eyes." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Sometimes, sir, faces from the past feel closer than they are." He smiled faintly and set the album aside.
Yeah.
"Maybe you're right." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my little cot in the servants' room, holding an old picture I'd kept hidden all these years, the same one, but faded and creased. I wondered if God was playing with me, dangling hope like a thread just out of reach. Days after that, Daniel started spending more time at home. Maybe his marriage was falling apart, or maybe he was just tired of pretending. One evening, he came into the kitchen and said, "Mrs. Fields, do you believe in fate?" I looked up from the sink, surprised. "I believe in what love refuses to forget," I said. He smiled sadly. "That's beautiful. My mom used to say something like that." I turned away, blinking back tears. "She sounds like she loved you very much." He nodded. "I hope so." For the first time, he didn't call her my adoptive mother, just my mom. And in that tiny shift of words, I felt something bloom in my chest, fragile, but alive. Claire noticed it, of course. She saw the way Daniel smiled at me, how he'd defend me when she complained. "You're too soft with her," she'd hiss. "She's just the help." "She's kind," he'd reply. "You could learn something from her." The look she gave me after that could have cut glass.
Still, I stayed.
I endured the sharp words, the slammed doors, the loneliness. Because every day I got to see my son, even if he didn't know me, was worth a lifetime of pain. And for a while, things almost felt normal. I'd hum while cooking, and he'd peek in, teasing, "You sing, Mrs. Fields?" "Only when someone's hungry." I'd laugh. He'd grin, then keep singing. I started writing small notes on his lunch napkins. "Have a good day. Don't forget to smile." He never asked who wrote them, but I'd see them tucked in his desk drawer later, neatly folded, kept safe. I think he knew, not with his mind, but with his heart. Some part of him recognized the rhythm of love, the unspoken care that never left him. But fate is never content to let peace last long. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner table, Claire came downstairs, her face pale, eyes burning. "You," she hissed. "You've been meddling where you shouldn't." I froze, the plate slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "And when he finds out, you'll ruin everything." That night, something changed, though I didn't know it yet. That night, I barely slept. Claire's words wouldn't stop echoing in my head. "I know who you are." How could she know? I'd been so careful. Every photograph hidden, every slip of memory swallowed before it escaped my lips. But she knew, and that meant the world I'd built, quiet, fragile, built from silence, was about to collapse. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Made coffee, ironed Daniel's shirt, smiled when he walked into the kitchen. "Morning, Mrs. Fields," he said, still half asleep. "You're up early." "I always am, sir," I whispered, my hands trembling as I poured his coffee. He smiled, that same boyish grin that used to melt my heart. "You really don't have to do all this." "Oh, but I do," I said softly. "It's what I live for." He chuckled, not knowing how true that was. Claire came down a few minutes later. Her heels clicked across the floor like sharp warnings. She didn't greet me, just looked at me with that icy stare. "Daniel," she said, "we need to talk later. Privately." He frowned. "About what?" "About your maid." I froze, the cup in my hand shaking so badly that coffee spilled onto the counter. Daniel sighed. "Claire, not again. She's done nothing wrong." Claire's lips curled into a thin smile. "We'll see about that." I wanted to run. I wanted to leave that house, pack my small bag, and disappear again before my truth could hurt him. But something held me there. Maybe hope, maybe foolishness. I told myself, she's bluffing. She can't know everything. Later that afternoon, While they were upstairs, I stood by the window folding laundry, pretending not to hear their voices rising behind the closed door. But I did. Every word. "You've been distant," Claire was saying. "You care more about that old woman than your own wife." "That's ridiculous," Daniel said. "She's just kind, that's all." "Kind?" Claire laughed bitterly. "You think she's just a maid? Open your eyes, Daniel. Don't you see the way she looks at you? The way she—" "Enough, Claire." His voice cracked, frustrated. "She's twice our age, for God's sake." "Exactly," she spat. "And she knows everything about you, your childhood, your lullabies, your habits. Don't you think that's strange?" Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then Daniel said, slower this time, She reminds me of my mother." And upstairs, I pressed a hand to my mouth so I wouldn't cry out. Claire's voice turned cold. "Your real mother. The one you never met." "What are you talking about?" She stepped closer. I could hear her heels against the hardwood. "That made you defend so much? Her name isn't Mrs. Fields. Her real name is Margaret. Margaret Fieldson. Check the adoption records if you don't believe me." I heard a crash, a drawer, maybe. Then Daniel's voice, low and trembling. "No, that can't be." Claire said nothing. Just let the silence do the rest. A few seconds later, the door burst open and Daniel came down the stairs. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He didn't say a word as he walked past me, grabbed his coat, and left. The sound of that door slamming shut felt like thunder inside my chest. Claire followed slowly, arms crossed, satisfaction painted across her face. "You brought this on yourself," she whispered. "You should have stayed gone." I wanted to scream, to tell her she had no idea what love could make a woman do. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat like stones. I just stood there, surrounded by the echo of a life I was about to lose again. Hours passed. The sun went down. The house fell silent. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee I'd poured that morning. The clock ticked louder than usual. Every sound felt like a countdown. Then the door opened. Daniel walked in. His face was unreadable. He didn't look at me, just stood there, keys still in his hand. "Finally," he said. "Is it true?" My heart dropped. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. He took a step closer. "Is it true?" he repeated, voice breaking. I tried to steady my breath. "Daniel." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't call me that. I didn't mean for you to find out like this," I whispered. "So it's true," he said. You're my mother?" I nodded, tears falling before I could stop them. "Yes, baby. Yes, I am." He stepped back, shaking his head.
No.
"No, this is insane. My parents told me you died when I was little." "They lied," I said quietly. "They told me they'd let me see you again. But they never did." He looked at me then, really looked, and in that moment, I saw my little boy in his eyes, frightened and lost. "I gave you up because I had no choice," I said, voice trembling. "You were dying, Daniel. I had nothing. They promised to save you. And they did. But they took you away from me." He shook his head slowly, like trying to wake from a bad dream. "Why didn't you tell me when you came here?" "How could I said softly. "You had a life."
A wife.
"I didn't want to ruin it." He turned away, hands on his head. "All this time you were right here." "I was," I whispered. "Every morning, every meal, every birthday you didn't know I remembered." He laughed, but it wasn't joy. It was pain, disbelief. "You served me tea. You cleaned my house. You called me sir." "Because I didn't deserve to call you son," I said, voice breaking. "Not after losing you once." He didn't say anything for a long time. The clock kept ticking, slow and cruel. Then he whispered, "I don't know how to feel right now." "You don't have to," I said gently. "Just let me explain." He sank into a chair, face buried in his hands. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "I thought you were dead." "I know," I said softly. "I wanted to tell you, every day. But then you'd smile, and I'd think, maybe it's enough just to see you happy." "I'm so sorry, Danny." He didn't move, didn't look up, just whispered, "You don't get to call me that." That one sentence, it felt like my heart was ripped apart twice. I stood there, unsure what to do. My son, my own flesh and blood, sitting a few feet away, yet farther than he'd ever been. Finally, he stood. "I need time," he said, walking toward the door. "Of course," I whispered. "Take all the time you need." But before he stepped outside, he turned and said, "You should have told me sooner." Then he was gone. The silence that followed, it was unbearable. I sank to the floor, clutching the chair leg like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Tears streamed down my face until there was nothing left. A mother waits her whole life to be called mom. I'd waited 30 years, and when I finally heard it, it was said in anger. I must have fallen asleep on the kitchen floor because when I opened my eyes, the room was dark. The clock said 2:47 a.m. And that's when I noticed the album. The one that came in the mail. It was open on the counter, flipped to the photo of me and baby Daniel. But there was another envelope tucked behind it, one I hadn't seen before. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Inside were letters.
Dozens of them.
All addressed to me. My name, Margaret Fields, written in the same handwriting I'd once seen on the adoption papers. I opened the first one. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Dear Margaret, we know we've broken our promise. We can't let you see him. You'd confuse him. Please understand, this is best for him." There were more letters. Some from Mrs. Harrison, others from Robert, my husband, the man who left me. He had written too. "He'll never know the truth, Margaret. It's better that way. Let him believe you're gone." My knees gave out. I sat on the cold tile, surrounded by lies written in ink that still smelled faintly of smoke and perfume. That's when it hit me. Claire must have found them first. That's how she knew. She had gone through the album, found the letters, and planned to use them to destroy me. "Stay with me till the end," I whisper now, staring into the camera of memory. What I found next still keeps me awake at night, because in the bottom of that envelope, there was one last letter, dated just months before the Harrisons died. "If anything ever happens to us, Daniel must know the truth. The woman who raised him isn't the one who gave him life. You are." But that letter was never sent. It was hidden, buried beneath time, lies, and someone's guilt. And the one person who could have set everything right was gone. The next morning, Daniel came back. His eyes were red, his face drawn. He looked older, wearier. He sat at the table without a word. "I found the letters," I said quietly. He nodded. So did I. For a long time, we just sat there, two broken pieces of the same heart. Finally, he reached across the table, his hand trembling as it touched mine. "I don't know how to forgive you," he said. "You don't have to," I whispered. "Just know I never stopped loving you." He squeezed my hand, just once, then pulled away. "I need to think," he said again. I nodded, smiling through tears. "I'll be here when you're ready." But deep down I knew something in him had changed forever. And that night, as the house fell quiet and the moonlight spilled across the floor, I realized sometimes love doesn't reunite families. Sometimes it just teaches you how much you can lose and still keep living. That night, I prayed for the same thing I had when he was a baby, not for myself, but for him. For peace. For forgiveness. For the kind of sleep that doesn't come with memories. Because the truth may set you free, but it never sets you back. I remember that morning as clear as the lines on my palms. The rain had stopped, but the smell of wet earth still clung to the air. I was standing by the kitchen counter, hands trembling around a chipped mug of coffee, watching the clock tick past 6 a.m. The house was silent, too silent for a place that used to echo with laughter. My son, Matthew, had gone to work early. His wife, Clara, hadn't returned since the argument. I could feel the ghost of everything that had just happened, her words, sharp as knives, cutting through the air. And his face, my son's face, red with anger, veins visible on his neck. He had yelled, begged, cried, then fallen to his knees when Clara slammed the door and left. And I stood there in my maid's uniform, invisible as ever. He didn't even glance at me when he walked past. My own son. My blood. That night, after he finally went to bed, I sat alone in the servants' quarters, my old notebook open before me. It was the same one I'd kept since the day I gave him up, full of his childhood photos, the hospital tag, and the first letter I ever wrote to him but never sent. My hand hovered over the page as I whispered, "He deserves to know. Maybe it's time." But then I remembered the look in his eyes, the pride, the distance, the arrogance that came from believing he had built everything on his own. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Still, something in me had shifted. For years, I had lived as a shadow in his house, cleaning his floor, washing his clothes, hiding my tears behind a gentle smile. But that day, the silence became too loud to bear. I picked up my old phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Margaret," I whispered when the line connected. "It's Evelyn. I think I'm ready to fix what I broke." Margaret had been my friend since we were both 19, before everything went wrong, before the adoption, before the shame. She was one of the few who knew the truth about Matthew. When she came to see me 2 days later, she looked shocked at how I was living. "You're his maid," she whispered, glancing around the house. "Evelyn, he doesn't know?" I shook my head, smiling sadly.
Not yet.
"But I think he's about to." Margaret put her hand on mine. "Are you sure you're doing this for him? Or for yourself?" I didn't answer, because deep down I wasn't sure anymore. Maybe both. Over the next week, Clara's absence tore Matthew apart. He barely ate, barely slept. Work calls went unanswered. Every night he'd sit on the couch with a glass of whiskey, staring at the front door, hoping she'd come back. And every night, I'd silently clean around him, folding blankets, picking up empty bottles, my heart aching to hold him like I used to when he was a boy afraid of the dark. One night, he mumbled through tears, "I don't understand, Mary. I did everything right. I gave her everything."
Mary.
That's what he called me, the name I'd used when I applied for the maid's job 3 years ago. I forced a smile. "Maybe she needed something money couldn't buy, sir." He looked at me with tired eyes. "Like what?" "Like truth," I said softly. He didn't reply, but his eyes flickered, like something inside him recognized the weight of my words. That was the first time I saw a crack in his armor. Days turned into weeks. Clara didn't return, but she did send a letter, one I found on the porch while cleaning. It was addressed to him, but something told me to read it first. My fingers hesitated, trembling, before I carefully opened it. Inside, her handwriting flowed across the paper like a storm of guilt. "Matthew, I can't stay in a house built on lies. I found the papers, the adoption file. You never told me you were adopted. I don't blame you, but I can't live in a place that feels so hollow. Maybe one day, you'll understand why truth matters more than pride." My heart stopped. He never knew. He didn't even know he was adopted. My knees gave way as I fell against the wall, the paper still in my hands. All these years, I thought he'd known. I thought his distance came from resentment. But no, he didn't even know I existed. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Oh God, I've punished him for nothing." That night, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of rain tapping on the window. My heart was pounding. Every breath felt like a confession waiting to be spoken. In the morning, I found Matthew sitting by the kitchen table, the letter open before him. His eyes were red, his lips trembling. "Did you know?" he asked suddenly. I froze. "Did you know I was adopted?" he repeated, louder this time. I swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I knew." He looked at me, confused.
How?
I took a deep breath. My voice shook. "Because I was there. The day they took you." He frowned. "What do you mean?" My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the chair. I could barely form the words. "Because I'm your mother, Matthew." Silence. The kind of silence that screams. He blinked, staring at me as if I'd spoken another language. Then he laughed, a broken, hollow laugh. That's not funny." Tears blurred my vision. "I'm not joking. I gave you up when you were a baby. I watched you grow from afar. I became your maid because I wanted to be close to you, just to see you happy. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping the floor. Stop it. You're lying. I have proof, I whispered, reaching into my apron. I pulled out the old envelope, the hospital documents, the photos, the letter I wrote on the day he was born. Look at them, Matthew. Please. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. His eyes moved across the photos, the baby wrapped in a blue blanket, the tag with his name, the young woman smiling faintly at the camera. His voice broke. This can't be real. I was just 17, I whispered. I was poor. Alone. I couldn't raise you. They told me adoption was your best chance. And then, when I found you years later, you didn't recognize me. You hired me as your maid. He sank into the chair, his hands covering his face. You should have told me. I wanted to. Every day. But I was afraid you'd hate me.
He didn't respond.
Just sat there, shaking, whispering to himself. All my life has been a lie. Don't blink now. What happened next changed everything. A few days passed before he spoke to me again. He barely left his room. The house felt colder than ever. I thought I'd lost him for good. But then, one morning, I found an envelope under my door. Inside was a note in his handwriting. Meet me in the living room at 7 p.m., Matthew. I waited all day, nerves twisting in my stomach. When the clock struck 7, I walked into the room and saw him sitting by the fireplace, a box on the table in front of him. He looked up. His eyes were red but calm. Sit down, he said quietly. I obeyed, hands folded in my lap. He opened the box and slid it toward me. Inside were the maid's uniform, the paycheck envelopes, and a gold bracelet I'd once lost while cleaning. You don't work for me anymore, he said. You're not my maid. Tears filled my eyes. Then what am I? He paused, his voice barely a whisper. You're my mother. The bracelet glimmered in the firelight, the same bracelet my late husband had given me before we lost everything. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was reach across the table and touch his hand. He didn't pull away this time. Over the next few weeks, we began rebuilding, slowly, carefully. He told me about Clara, about his childhood, about his fears. I told him everything I'd hidden, the pain, the shame, the years I spent working just to see him smile from afar. And for the first time in decades, I felt seen. But the world doesn't forgive easily. When Clara eventually returned, she wasn't the same. She wanted a divorce. She said she couldn't live in a house built on secrets, even if the truth had finally come out. Matthew was shattered. But this time I didn't hide. I held his hand. I cooked his meals. I reminded him that pain doesn't destroy love, it reveals it. One evening, as the sun set behind the porch, he turned to me and said, Mom, you don't have to work anymore. I smiled softly. Oh, I know that. But maybe I'll still cook sometimes. Old habits die hard. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. And as I watched him, I realized something. Revenge hadn't been about hurting anyone. It had been about reclaiming myself, my truth, my dignity, my motherhood. For years, I lived as a ghost in my son's house. But now, every corner of that home held my heartbeat again. And for the first time since I was 17, I felt like Evelyn, not Mary the maid. Evelyn, the mother. Morning light has a different color now. It's softer, warmer somehow. When it falls across the curtains in the kitchen, it paints golden streaks on the table I once scrubbed every morning as a maid. I still wake up early. Old habits don't disappear easily. But now, when I brew coffee, there's no rush, no footsteps to chase, no orders to obey. Just the steady drip of the pot, the smell of roasted beans, and the sound of my own breathing filling the room. Sometimes I still set 2 cups on the table. Then I remember I only need 1. The second cup sits there, steaming gently, as if waiting for someone who's never late, just gone. I never pour it out. I let it cool, like a small offering to the years that broke me and the love that healed me. Matthew moved to another city last spring, new job, new start. He wanted me to come with him, but I said no. This is your time, I told him. Go live the life I always dreamed you'd have. He hugged me so tight, I could barely breathe. You'll visit? He asked. Only if you promise to call, I said, smiling through tears. He calls every Sunday. He talks about work, about therapy, about how he's learning to cook without burning everything. He laughs now. A real laugh, not the one that hides pain. And every time he says, Mom, I feel a quiet joy bloom in my chest. It still feels new. It still feels like a gift I was never sure I'd get to open. The house feels different now that it's just me. The silence used to sting, but now it feels like peace. I started tending to the small garden out back again. The same one I used to look at through the kitchen window while washing dishes. The roses are blooming this year. Bright, proud, unapologetically alive.
I talk to them sometimes.
Maybe that sounds silly, but I think flowers listen better than most people. When the wind blows, I swear I can hear the echoes of the past. Clara's heels clicking on the floor. Matthew's laughter before life made him hard. And me, humming to myself while folding laundry, pretending not to ache when he walked past without seeing me. But I don't cry anymore. I just breathe. Because now I know, every small act of love, even unseen, leaves a mark. I learned something I wish every mother could know. Love doesn't need recognition to be real. It survives even when buried under years of silence and shame. It waits, patiently, until the world is ready to see it. I remember the night I finally told Matthew everything. After our talk, I went back to my little room, sat on the bed, and looked around. It still smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. My maid's uniform hung on the door, neatly pressed, as if waiting for me to wear it again. But I didn't. The next morning, I folded it carefully and placed it in a box along with the notebook, the adoption papers, and the letter I once wrote him as a baby. I tied it shut with a piece of string. Then I whispered, "We're free now." Sometimes I still open that box, not to relive the pain, but to remind myself of how far I've come. Every wrinkle on my hands tells a story of survival. Every scar a lesson. I used to think motherhood was about sacrifice. Now I know it's also about forgiveness, forgiving the world, forgiving fate, and forgiving yourself. Last week I received a letter. Not from Matthew, from Clara. I stared at the envelope for hours before opening it. Her handwriting was still the same, elegant, precise, almost fragile. The letter began simply.
Evelyn, I'm sorry. I wasn't ready to understand back then.
But now I see what you did for him, for both of us. You raised him without him knowing, and still gave him love every single day. You're stronger than I ever was. Thank you. I didn't realize I was crying until the tears dropped onto the paper, blurring her words. I folded it gently, pressed it to my chest, and whispered, "Thank you for letting him go when I couldn't." It felt like the world had finally exhaled. Evenings are my favorite now. When the sun dips behind the trees, I sit on the porch with my cup of tea, listening to the cicadas hum their slow summer song. That sound, that low, endless drone, reminds me of life itself. Steady, imperfect, but always moving. Sometimes I close my eyes and imagine I'm back in the past, holding baby Matthew in my arms, humming that same rhythm against his tiny heartbeat. If I could go back, I'd still make the same choices. Maybe differently, maybe sooner, but I'd still do it. Because being near him, even when he didn't know who I was, gave my life meaning. Every floor I scrubbed, every meal I cooked, every tear I hid, it was all love, disguised as duty. Now I finally understand something I wish I'd known then. We don't serve people we love because we're weak. We serve them because it's the only way our love knows how to speak. One morning, while watering the garden, I found an old photograph half buried in the soil. It was faded and damp, but I could still make out the image. A young boy with wild hair and a gap-toothed grin, holding a toy airplane. My heart stuttered. It was Matthew, maybe 7 or 8 years old. I must have dropped it years ago, and the earth had been keeping it safe for me all this time. I washed it gently under the tap, dried it with a corner of my apron, and placed it on the kitchen shelf. It's still there. A quiet reminder that nothing we love ever truly gets lost. It just waits to be found again, sometimes by accident, sometimes by grace. I think about my younger self a lot lately. The frightened 17-year-old girl who gave her baby away because the world told her she wasn't enough. I wish I could hold her hand and tell her, "You were enough all along." But maybe she wouldn't believe me. Maybe she had to live through the years of pain and silence to understand what strength really means. And now, in the mirror, when I see the lines around my eyes, I smile. They're proof that I survived every sleepless night, every unspoken word, every heartbreak that almost broke me but didn't. The town's children often wave when they pass my gate. Some even stop by for cookies. I always bake too many. They call me Grandma Eve. I like that. It makes me feel like the world gave me another chance at motherhood, just in a different way. One of the little girls asked me last week, "Grandma, what does love mean?" I thought for a while, then told her, "Love means showing up, even when no one knows you're there." She nodded, smiled, and ran off to play. I stood there for a long time after she left, thinking, maybe that's all I ever did. I showed up, quietly, every day. Sometimes at night, I still hear echoes of my old life. The creak of the stairs, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the washing machine. Those sounds used to chain me to my pain. Now they comfort me. They remind me that I gave everything I could, and that it was enough. I light a candle before bed every night. It's lavender-scented, my favorite. The smell fills the room and lingers on the curtains. That scent has become the symbol of my peace. It's the smell of forgiveness, of healing, of home. When I close my eyes, I imagine Matthew sitting somewhere far away, maybe holding his own cup of coffee, thinking of me the same way I think of him, with quiet gratitude. And maybe, just maybe, that's all the happy ending I ever needed. If I've learned one thing, it's this. Sometimes life takes everything from you, your name, your pride, your place in the world, only to give it back years later in a form you never expected. And when it does, you realize the truth you've been running from. You were never invisible. You were just waiting for the world to catch up to your love. So yes, I worked as a maid for my own son, but I also watched him grow into a man of honor. And in the end, he saw me, not as a servant, but as the mother who never stopped waiting. That's all I ever wanted. If you've listened this far, thank you. Did you feel her pain? Tell me what city you're listening from. I love reading your stories. And if this touched your heart, subscribe and stay with me for more true-feeling life journeys. Because somewhere out there, another Evelyn is still waiting to be seen.